We'll welcome and very fortunate to have Holger Schultz with us. Holger is the CEO and founder of Cybersecurity Insiders. It's a community of over 500,000 information security professionals. And he's also a frequent publisher of research that reflects the sentiment of the security industry. Holger, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, Kevin, and thank you for having me.
And one of the things, and perhaps a quick introduction for myself, my name is Kevin Shu. I run marketing at BitGlass, and interlaced with the perspectives that you'll hear from Holger, I'll also include some things that we've been able to call from our CIO and CISO communities as well. Now, one of the really interesting things that Holger has done over the last year, and in particular, he published a report on BYOD sentiment last month, is kind of the reflection on why adoption of BYOD has become so pronounced, but also the challenges that we're seeing as people are trying, and security teams and IT teams are trying to adopt them at such a accelerated pace. Before we jump into some of that research, perhaps it's helpful just to level set ourselves for a moment on how we got to this moment where it is so important. It is a 10-year journey. If we take ourselves back over the course of the last decade, these BYOD initiatives really do tie to this idea that every company, regardless of size, industry, geography, ultimately is trying to become a technology company, whether it's because of the way that employees are asked to interact with each other, whether it's a matter of the partner experience and how they interact with your company, or whether it's a matter of trying to improve the customer experience. And you saw from the chart earlier from Nat that there's different tenets that come with digital transformation, whether it's the infrastructure itself and how cloud becomes part of the story, and whether it's the applications that you adopt, whether it's the data that you have to secure and where that is located. But ultimately and foundationally, those things all require something to interact with it, and that something is the endpoint. And in the last 5 years, 10 years, that something and that device and that endpoint has increasingly been something that is not issued by the company, whether it's your mobile device and whether it's your personal device. And that's why we'll bring back this image. It's, there are very few digital transformation initiatives that can achieve success without BYOD being a core part of that. And in fact, I'm not sure that we really see that many transformative initiatives that are able to reach their objectives without BYOD being a part of that success, or without them being able to check off the box that says, well, my BYOD initiatives were a success, and as a result of it, that then drove my transformative initiatives. And that's where, Holger, I know you've done quite a bit of research to reflect, to capture some of that sentiment. We'd love for you to share some of the results that came out of that report.
Excellent, thank you, Kevin. And yeah, so as you said, we conducted a comprehensive comprehensive survey earlier this year on the state of BYOD, and to figure out what are some of the key drivers, key challenges, how do organizations approach them. And one of the first questions we asked was, what user groups does your organization enable BYOD for? Right? That's a good starting point. And while BYOD is typically associated with company employees bringing unmanaged devices into the workplace, about 70% in our survey, the concept, of course, also applies to a variety of other groups, right, and roles affiliated with an organization. And respondents to our survey said that their organizations also enable BYOD for the extended workforce, right, such as contractors, partners, and suppliers. 61% for that group, and even customers, 18%. On the next slides, we drill down a little deeper on the why. Why are organizations embracing BYOD? Why is adoption of BYOD happening and it's accelerating? Organizations, of course, realize a number of significant benefits from adopting BYOD for mobile and remote users, especially during and following the COVID-19 pandemic, right, that we experienced over the course of the last year or so. Now, our survey reveals that the most common benefit mentioned in our survey by our cybersecurity experts is really improved employee productivity, right, from BYOD at 68% here. This is followed by greater employee satisfaction, right? Can't hurt that folks are happy and productive, followed by reduced cost at 45%. Clearly, you can see there's much to gain, right, by enabling unmanaged device access. So the benefits are strong. So we looked at the benefits. The second quick look at the impact, right, that remote work is having on organizations. I just mentioned COVID-19. So we asked in our survey, how has the shift to remote work affected, right, the number of BYOD devices used in your organization? And because of the massive shift to remote work due to COVID-19, there's no secret, right, that the number of BYOD has increased quite a bit. And almost half of the organizations in our survey report a significant increase in BYOD out of necessity, right, for many organizations. And this trend, by the way, will challenge, I think, and we see this with a lot of our clients, the use of security measures, right, designed for managing traditional endpoints. And Kevin, I think you will talk a little bit about this, but let me ask you, how do you see things shifting, and what are the implications for security?
Yeah, I think what we're going to see increasingly is that it's not so much a matter of either or. And, I think what's often forgotten about BYOD is that it's not just your mobile device. It's not necessarily your laptop. It's both. And then in line with that, with both, is that companies will still continue to issue devices, whether it's your phone or whether it's your laptop. But at the same time, you'll start to see more and more people add or use a personal device on top of that, whether it's your iPad or a tablet that then becomes the third device, or for many, there are some applications that just perform better on a device that you're used to using on a personal basis. So I think what we've learned in the last year, somewhat as a forcing function, is that there is, in fact, a really nice mix between what your company gives you and also what you yourself may be used to using. In fact, maybe I'll just share one story from this last year. We did see that one of the drivers for BYOD was just because devices were breaking. And in the past 18 months ago, let's say, if your device broke, you could just take your computer, walk over to your help desk, and somebody at the help desk would help you. When you're working from home, when your computer breaks, there is no help desk to go to. And so what you do, you just grab that computer that's sitting in the corner of your closet, bring it out, and suddenly you're productive again. So I think all of that interaction is new muscle memory that we've learned that increases. My suspicion is that that old statistic of everybody working with I forget how many devices, will probably increase to something above 3. Holger, I'm not sure if that's consistent with what you've seen as well.
Absolutely, yeah, we're seeing the exact same thing. Thank you, Kevin.
Great. So I think that sentiment, that's the upside of BYOD. Now, there are, of course, these things, of course, don't come without some challenges and things that need to be thought through as we think about how you can unlock the potential of that productivity while still being able to secure it. And it's part of an overall challenge that any company is going to be facing when it comes to digital transformation. And it's this transition where your IT teams and your security teams used to control everything, or at the very least have visibility into everything. We're talking about devices right now, but that's only one component of the overall footprint that IT teams are starting to lose control over. Your network used to be entirely issued or controlled by the company. You knew exactly where the perimeter was. Your identity alone would have been sufficient. And your data would have been located exactly where you expected to be located, or typically inside of your data center, or typically on a device that is well controlled by your IT teams. Versus today, that control has largely become distributed. I'm talking to you on a home network that I assume is not impacted or controlled by BitGlass. We expect much more context when it comes to security beyond just identity. And then your data is just a little bit of everywhere. Most likely, you don't even know where it necessarily is. And saving the device for the very end, in line with that, it's not just your managed device, it's also your BYOD device that becomes much more complicated when you take into account the variations. It's not just my iPhone 7 or my iPhone 10 or my iPhone 12. It's actually all the variations of operating systems, all the different generations of the devices. When you take all these iterations into effect, it becomes increasingly very complex to be able to secure all these different devices on top of all these other parts of the infrastructure that are slowly moving beyond the control of the IT and security teams. I think, Holger, your research reflects some of that as well. Could you share some of that sentiment?
Yeah, that's exactly right, Kevin. And so in our research, next we wanted to dive deeper into how organizations currently support BYOD users, right, who are experiencing device issues or access issues. And not surprisingly, the different support levels, right, for BYOD that we're seeing that are reflected here on the screen are fairly evenly distributed. There seems to be no runaway, standard motion that's been established for BYOD support in that respect. And you can see a quarter of organizations provides only limited help, right, for designated models only, designated device models, 26% here. That's followed by another quarter roughly that provides basically only ad hoc support, but without formal capabilities and processes, right? Less than a quarter, 22% here, provides full support of all mobile device varieties, right, including laptops, tablets, phones. But in my view, what's really alarming in a way is the 20% you see at the bottom that provide no dedicated BYOD user support whatsoever, right? Meaning that individuals have basically to troubleshoot any unmanaged device issues themselves, possibly during work hours, and that can't be good for productivity. So support of BYOD is clearly a challenge, right? So in our survey, we asked, what else is keeping organizations from adopting BYOD at a faster rate? And not surprisingly, the main barrier still is security. We talked about this, right? And much of today's content will be about security. And that's been highlighted by 30% of respondents. And somewhat less significant, but still important, are employees' privacy concerns, right? And support cost concerns, reflecting what we just discussed in the previous slide. And regardless of the specific barrier, right, the fact is that organizations need to think differently, right, and deploy different kinds of solutions when it comes to BYOD. And privacy, I mentioned privacy a minute ago, still a key issue for employees. So we drilled deeper into the privacy concerns and we asked, how would BYOD adoption, how would it change if IT could not view or alter your personal data, right, and apps in your organization? And about half of respondents, pretty strong share of survey sample, half of respondents expect BYOD adoption to increase, right, if their organization could better address privacy concerns. So that's a strong response, and perhaps not surprisingly. Nobody really wants their employee in their private devices, right? So that's a key barrier to adoption. Now let's take a closer look at security. I mentioned that's the #1 barrier for BYOD adoption. And cybersecurity professionals continue to have, a variety of security concerns regarding BYOD. So let's go down a little deeper. At the top of the list, you can see is data leakage or loss, with 62% of respondents selecting that as their main security concern. Other critical concerns here include users downloading unsafe apps or content at 54%, lost or stolen devices, 53%, and unauthorized access to company data and systems. And obviously, there are countless ways, right, data can leak through BYOD, making the implementation, right, of appropriate security measures absolutely critical. Let's go down a little deeper on malware. That's another critical concern, and one that on the malware side, or through personal device use, right, and bringing malware into the organization, especially ransomware has been in the news lately on that note. 22% of organizations surveyed can confirm that unmanaged devices have been used to download malware in the last 12 months, right? That is the people that were aware of it. But what's alarming is that 49% were unsure or unable to disclose whether they had malware issues with personal unmanaged devices. That would make me nervous, right? If I were to run organizations' IT security, cybersecurity environment. And this lack of visibility, worst case, can prove fatal. 41% of organizations today, and perhaps we'll drill down on that a little deeper, they rely on endpoint malware protection, right, for BYOD, and an approach, as you might agree, that is not quite ideal for personal devices, right, which are hard to control and manage. And on the other hand, cloud-based malware protection tools are often a far better fit, but as we can see, they're used today far less often, by only, I think, 11% in our survey. And unfortunately, 30% of firms, about a third of organizations, don't protect against that malware for BYOD at all. So that finding made me nervous. Let's take a closer look at Wi-Fi, malicious Wi-Fi access, another path for security issues to enter an organization. And 22% of organizations confirm that their employee-owned devices have connected to malicious Wi-Fi networks in the past 12 months. Equally alarming, again, right, as we saw on the previous slide, but equally alarming is that about half of organizations have no way today of knowing their vulnerability, right, to malicious Wi-Fi on personal devices. Another popular, access point, another popular vulnerability for malicious code or hackers to enter systems is messaging, right? And so we asked, what security message capabilities do you have in place for mobile enterprise messaging? The most deployed security capabilities for mobile messaging includes, not surprisingly, getting control over shared files at 44%. That's followed by controlling connected cloud apps at 38%, and gaining visibility over messages shared in private channels, 29%. And again, an alarming, almost third of organizations, 29%, report they're having no visibility and no control over enterprise messaging at all. And it keeps repeating, right? It's a recurring theme. Lack of visibility is a recurring theme, which brings us to the next question about application visibility. And not surprisingly, many organizations, again, lack visibility into applications on BYOD. Device apps categories that organizations have the most visibility into include email, so that's a positive, that's 74%, followed by calendar functions, 58%, contacts, 55%, and messaging apps at 51%. But lacking this fundamental level of visibility across these basic applications, that does not bode well for enterprise BYOD security, as you might agree. So on that note, let me ask you, Kevin, how, in your mind, should organizations approach this issue of application visibility from a security perspective?
From an application security perspective, I think it comes down to, not that I want to shill the BitGlass product, but I really do think it comes down to having the right tools in place that give you visibility into these applications. Because at the end of the day, it is nearly impossible to individually track all the applications that all of the employees, partners, and in some cases customers are using. So you do need a way to be able to secure and almost put a layer of visibility in front of the applications themselves. And from there, I think it then comes down to the question, and so it comes down to a shadow IT question, having the right tools in place, like a CASB, if you will, to be able to get that visibility. But also on top of that, if we're talking about control, I think it also comes down to this discussion and sort of philosophically between whitelisting and blacklisting. And I think the safest way to go, rather than trying to blacklist the apps that you don't want people interacting with, because you'll never win that foot race. Your shadow IT will outpace any security team. But it really comes down to the applications you want them to use, and then the context and actions that you want them to be able to enforce when in fact interacting with those applications. Holger, I'm not sure about your perspective. I know you see this quite a bit, and you and I have talked about this before in the past. What are some of your perspectives there?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I agree with what you said, and the biggest hurdles, right, to visibility that we're seeing is just advancing technologies, advancing faster than many security tools, platforms can keep up with, and organizations aren't always prepared to, toss out and rip and replace security platforms every year. So that is a catch-up motion right there, and that was only exacerbated by just the last 12, 18 months of this massive shift to work from home, right? And many tools, platforms not having that visibility into endpoints, into mobile endpoints at the home office and remote locations, right? So those two trends, in my mind, are the key factors that are holding back organizations today. So there's a need, right, for platforms that enable that deeper visibility and enable deeper visibility into a very heterogeneous, distributed environment.
Now, Holger, before we progress on in the slides, I see that there's a bunch of questions in the chat and Q&A bar. And so perhaps we can cover a couple of these before moving on. And I'll just make note for the broader audience that you can enter questions into the chat or Q&A bar, and we'll either answer them directly in there or answer them as part of this discussion. And so just doing a quick scan through these in real time, I think there's actually two really interesting ones that I'll put out there now before moving on. The first is, do you have any recommendations on easy wins with easy wins begin quotes, if you're just beginning on a BYOD initiative. So I'll interpret that as, let's say you're just starting and you're pretty much at ground zero. Is there an easy way to approach securing BYOD? Holger, I'll let you offer your thoughts first.
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure I have sort of an easy answer, because obviously it's not a trivial problem, right? But solutions that start locking down mobile device management, for example, right? Perhaps traditional approach that start locking down some of the key vulnerabilities. That's something I'd recommend, right? One of the, by the way, and that's also what we see in other research. One of the key issues, in addition to technology, right, is user awareness. So I think a well-trained, well-aware workforce is something that I would focus on equally, if not with more focus than just the technology, right? So that lack of awareness of, for example, not to hop on unknown Wi-Fi networks, right? Or click on links and emails that look suspicious. So those behavioral aspects, that would be my advice to definitely start there and then build out the technological capabilities alongside. Kevin, what do you think?
I think the same as well. In fact, I'll share a sentiment from a CISO who's in our community. He brought up the point that don't worry about the technology initially, worry more about your use case. And once you have the use case, then the technology that needs to be deployed becomes really apparent. And I think in the context of easy wins, there's probably two use cases that then become easy wins. And they're somewhat intertwined, but I think the first is what you and I just talked about. Clearly, visibility is a challenge, but also clearly visibility is the first step. Without that visibility, you don't know what to do as a second step. So whether it's shadow IT or whether it's getting visibility into your BYOD devices, I think that is going to be core to it. And then the second is also just knowing which applications you want to enable for BYOD. I think it's fair to say that you may have a work-related application, but you'll have different levels of comfort on whether you want a managed device to interact with that application and the data that will be in it, versus when you're comfortable with an iPad or a tablet coming into the fold that you may not necessarily really be all that comfortable with yet. And then maybe over time, your agita will progress on. So there's another question that I'll just pose before we move on. It's a little bit of a non sequitur, but I think it's relevant. How do I justify the potential costs to secure BYOD? Because, and I wouldn't be surprised if cost and budget is a question in nearly every discussion we have today. But Holger, what's your thought on that?
Yeah, that's a good question, and that's always one of the toughest challenges, right, for any IT or IT security organization trying to allocate budget to these, expensive investments. And obviously, that's a much longer, conversation than we have time for today. But I would start with a risk-based approach, right? And what is the risk-adjusted? What is the likelihood, right, of an event occurring and its impact on the business, right? And with that, you can do back of the envelope calculations of what an occurrence of maybe a ransomware attack, right, or downtime of perhaps a couple of days due to malware, or whatever the event is that you want to protect against. What would that mean to the business? And we've seen over the last couple of weeks and months some very interesting real-world examples, right? For example, I think that pipeline incident a couple of months ago that took out, gas stations across the entire East Coast was a pretty stark reminder of how significant a business impact ransomware in that example can have. And so that, to make a long story short, would be my approach: to look at the risk, look at the potential impact, and make a calculation from there. It is basically a similar approach to why buy insurance, right? So, but I'm interested, Kevin, in your perspective.
I think maybe I'll share a perspective from another customer that we have who's much smarter than me. We have a financial services customer who had an experience where the cost of securing BYOD isn't necessarily as expensive as you might think it is. And for them, it's because they were undergoing this overall transformative event. And as part of, whether you want to call it digital transformation or what have you, in many cases, when you're securing BYOD, that doesn't necessarily have to be a net new tool. And that tends to be where a lot of cost does drive from. Like whether, we just talked about CASB, but, and of course today we have this overarching SASE theme. In a lot of cases, the ability to secure BYOD is part of a larger spend that you're already undergoing anyways. So I think if there is a point of advice is see if there's a way to use existing tools that you're about to embark on deploying, because that will initially be your largest cost, especially from a CapEx perspective, versus, especially some of these cloud tools today, they natively take into account how you secure BYOD interactions. So Holger, to progress on in the slides, in fact, some of these things I think we might have just finished talking about, so we can speed through a couple of these. But I think fundamental to this question and some of the recommendations that we'll cull together as closing thoughts, the foundational question then becomes: do you trust not only what's on the endpoint, but do you trust the endpoint itself? And as we think about how important this endpoint is, I think there was this point that was brought up as part of discussion that your BYOD device, or your device period, is potentially the control point before terminal velocity. And I think and when we say terminal velocity, we mean it as a matter of the point before you lose visibility. And so it does speak to the importance of the endpoint. And maybe a very small example is, for instance, I could take my BYOD device, log into, say, my Office 365 application of choice, download a document that might be sensitive, let's say a product spec, then upload it into my personal Dropbox account. And at that point, I've largely lost control over every step that occurs after that. From my Dropbox account, I could access it from another device, from another account. I could share directly from that application. And from there, in most cases, you do not see step 3, 4, 5 of data exfiltration experience. And so it begs the question, and in fact, it makes, not to make things even more grim, but in order for these things, if you then layer on how pronounced and important this is, and how this could potentially be the final mile before that data accelerates out of your purview, there's then the important experience that we do see, that BYOD and securing BYOD, the most common reason for failure is because it doesn't take into account user experience. So I think the misnomer is that if I define great security requirements, I will be able to secure BYOD. And the reality is that that isn't having great security policies. By nature of BYOD being sort of a hybrid personal and business device, it means that there's other ways that people will find ways to be productive that are then out of your control and that are then very difficult to secure. And so given some of these tenets, the importance of productivity and still maintaining productivity in light of the security requirements that you have, and maybe I'll give an example of that in a second, how BYOD in your devices could be the final mile before data moves out of your purview. And then all of the challenges that Holger just shared in his research. There's a couple of things that we thought we'd leave you with. Holger, it'd be great to get your perspective on a couple of these things. But if we first talk about user experience, it is important to consider that user experience that we just talked about is incredibly important. And if it's slow, if it's cumbersome, if it makes my experience terrible, it ultimately leads to a shadow IT problem. I think the last year has been the best example of this. The number of people that found that they couldn't get online, they couldn't get productive, suddenly found themselves just spinning up applications using their Gmail accounts or their Yahoo accounts or their personal accounts, and just uploading their data there and then operating as a normal cadence in their in your personal applications. I think it's also important that we want to take into account that when we think about these devices, they hold both work and personal data. And this may seem obvious, but by nature of that, it means that your policies can't be too broad. I can't just have a policy that locks down my entire device itself. I need to take into account the use case, whether it's the application, whether it's the account with which I'm logging into an application, or the action that I'm taking with the application, or what I'm doing with the data itself. And we talked about blacklisting versus whitelisting. And then maybe the final note is then that performance and privacy really matter quite a bit now. They have always mattered, but today, and as we look at what appears to be a hybrid work environment in the foreseeable future, it does mean that if my security experience either degrades the speed with which I can access data or applications, that then coincides with my users starting to go off and doing things that I cannot track anymore. Holger, I'm not sure if you have any thoughts on the things that you're seeing on the screen here, but I think it relates to some of the research that you've come across.
Yes, absolutely. And especially the point at the bottom, performance and privacy matter. That reminds me, just a few minutes ago, we spoke about privacy and employees' privacy concerns. Half of employees are concerned about their private information on their personal devices, right? Perhaps leaking into the business realm, right, of the company they're working for. So half of them, that's a large number of people, right? So anything that can address that would accelerate and really put more momentum behind adoption of BYOD for sure. So just wanted to point that one out. That's a big roadmap today.
Wonderful. And to close off the day's discussion, we'll offer a few additional thoughts here as well. And actually, maybe I see one good question. I know we're running just at the top of the hour, but just to bleed us over the top of the hour by just a little bit, I do see a good Q&A question that I'm going to pull to get your thoughts, Holger. But as you're thinking about approaches to secure BYOD, here's some core tenets that we pull from our community. And Holger, I think this reflects a lot of the research that you've conducted. And we're certainly happy to have deeper discussions on what this might necessarily look like. But it does mean that security needs to be transparent in light of what actions might occur if you make security cumbersome. A good way to go is to consider, as possible, going agentless. And actually, maybe it's a default requirement since your personal devices really can't take agents anyways. We talked a bit about performance, but also increasingly, I think you can start with the improving performance of your end device. You can put more and more things that would have been in the data center or as a hop in your experience, pushing as much of that to the end compute device as well. And also taking into account privacy, but also as much as possible, I think number 7 is increasingly going to be important. Its ability to integrate that into your overall security posture and your overall security platform. And part of that is likely because of examples like DLP. You want the same and consistent policies for DLP as you would want for, say, your email, for your Slack, for your cloud apps, as you would for your home device, as you would for a device that your company is issuing. Holger, I'm not sure if you might have any thoughts on that.
Yes, absolutely. And I see there's a related Q&A question that came in on policy recommendations. And I agree with your list. I think if I had to pick my favorites, point 5 stands out for me again, right? Because it was such a big concern for users, is that respecting privacy. So any policy components, both on the controls technology side, but also on how BYOD policy is communicated to employees, should emphasize that respect for employees' privacy and the privacy of what's on their personal devices. If I have to pick 2 more, I would pick, perhaps they're related, go agentless and automate deployment, right? So the more or the less hands-on involvement is required, the lower the cost, the lower the burden on the IT team to manage BYOD. And that's especially important today with a massively distributed workforce that doesn't come into an office anymore to perhaps drop off a device and have something installed on it. So the more agentless, the more automatic the deployment, the better from that perspective. And yeah, make it transparent. Number 1, right? Make it so it doesn't impede or inhibit or bother the user and the workflow and the job they have to get done. It doesn't slow down in terms of performance. It doesn't require 10 additional clicks and people wondering how they can bypass it, but make it transparent. So those would be my three highlights from that sort of policy mix on that list. Kevin?
Wonderful. Well, Holger, that takes us to the very end. And I know that there's a couple of questions that are hanging chads that we're not able to get to right now. We'll make sure to collect those and get back to those of you who've entered questions that have gone unanswered in this portion. But Holger, thank you again for joining us and sharing your perspectives today.
Absolutely. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you for having me.